This may look like a camera bag, but it's so much more, and we're going to have some fun today. Hey everybody, it's Chris from Family Geekery, and what I've got inside this bag here is something that I've been interested in for a while, and just happened to find an awesome deal on it. So let's take this thing, open it up, and I'm going to show you what we're going to be playing with today. So this looks like an external hard drive, but it is in fact an external GPU. So this is a Gigabyte, and they call it the RX580 Gaming Box. Now this is nothing new by any means. This is an RX580 8GB GPU in here. So it's several years old, but I just happened to find it, and these things, let's say about a year ago, would have been extremely expensive because all the crypto mining and stuff. But now with everybody getting faster laptops and faster GPUs and not needing their old toys, I was able to get this real cheap. And not only did I get this, which we'll look at in just a second, but it came with the bag, which I'm guessing is the original Gigabyte bag. And the guy that sold it to me wasn't sure exactly which cables came with it, so he just gave me a whole bunch. So this is a Thunderbolt cable. I think this must be the original one just based on the color. That's just a guess. But he actually gave me a couple more Thunderbolt cables. And Thunderbolt cables aren't cheap. He also gave me a Thunderbolt 3 to mini DisplayPort or Thunderbolt 2 adapter, which has really nothing to do with this, but I'm going to be able to use this on some of my MacBooks and hook up an old display that I wasn't able to hook up before. So stay tuned for another video on this guy here. And then, like I said, a couple more. This is a DisplayPort cable or Thunderbolt 2 cable, and a couple more USB-C, probably Thunderbolt cables. And then, of course, the power cord was in here. So let's take a look at the actual box here and see what it's got. So if you've heard of external GPUs, or eGPUs for short, then you probably have an idea of what this is and what's inside. But this one is like tiny compared to other ones that I've seen before. Now, I've never gotten to successfully play with one of these before. I bought an open box version of, I forget what brand it was, but it was at Micro Center. It was open box, brought it home, and the thing didn't work. But it was considerably larger. Now, this being small is nice because it's nice and compact and lightweight, and it's got a cute little case to carry it in. But the downside of it is, if you ever wanted to replace this GPU, you'd have to find one that was equally as small. So this thing is a special GPU to fit inside here. It's, like I said, it's just an RX580 8GB model, but it's got the room for a double space card, but it would just have to be short. So I probably won't ever upgrade this particular GPU. I'll probably just keep it in here and play around with it. But besides the GPU, of course, it needs to have a power supply, so it's got a power supply in there. And then in addition to that, we've got the host hookup here, the Thunderbolt hookup, and then we've got several USBs. So you can actually hook up like mouse and keyboard and stuff to this and use this as a Thunderbolt dock for your laptop. So I thought that was pretty cool. So overall, pretty small, plenty of ventilation. It's got a screened side on both sides, plenty of ventilation to get the air flowing all the way through it, and nice and small and cute. So what we're actually going to be doing with the eGPU today is we're going to be doing several tests, and particularly I wanted to test this up against a laptop, a gaming laptop, and then use a kind of an Ultrabook to hook this up with and get some tests with and without the external GPU. So I'll explain all the tests here in a second. This has been an extremely laborious setup for this. I've spent hours getting everything set up to do these tests. So if you're going to watch this and enjoy it, now's the time to go ahead and pay up by hitting that like button. So that's your cost of entry into watching these tests. But what I'm going to be doing is I'm going to be taking my Matebook, which I've done several reviews, or I've done a video on, and I've used it in several of the videos. And this is an Ultrabook that's got a Thunderbolt adapter or Thunderbolt hookup to it. And this also has a NVIDIA MX150 2 GB internal GPU, if you will. So it's better than just the regular standard Intel graphics, but it's nowhere near as good as a gaming laptop. So this is still just an Ultrabook that's got an integrated 2 GB GPU. So what I'm going to be doing is doing a benchmark test with the internal NVIDIA GPU, and then I'm going to hook this up to the external GPU and run the same test and see how it fares. Now I'm going to take those results also, and I'm going to compare them up against what would have been a comparable gaming laptop for the same generation. So I'll bring that out towards the end and run the same test on that. So let me go ahead and get all the hardware set up for these tests and talk about what I'm actually going to be doing. Alright, so to run all these tests, I'm going to be using 3D Mark. Now I know there's no single perfect solution for benchmarking stuff, but for gaming type performance, 3D Mark is pretty good. Plus I'm going to be able to run the same test on all the different devices and all the different setups. And I've got this is a Steam license that I have that has upgrades, so I can do some custom tests and stuff. So that's what I'm going to be using for all these tests. Now this is, like I said, the Matebook, the Huawei Matebook. This is a couple years old, so you can see it's got an i7-8550U CPU, 4 cores and 8 threads, I believe. It's got the internal UHD, just the Intel 620 graphics, and then here's that NVIDIA GeForce MX150, the 2 GB GPU. So that's what we're going to be testing first. We're going to be testing this internal GPU. Now this Ultrabook here, great all-around computer, super lightweight, really nice display, and it's awesome for everything except for gaming. So it's got, like I said, it's got an internal GPU, but I've done some lightweight Steam gaming on it, and it works just fine, simple stuff. But as far as like 3D stuff goes, it's probably going to struggle a little bit. So we're going to run this Time Spy, which is a DirectX 12 benchmark, and you can select which GPU you want to use over here. So I'm going to select, of course, the MX150. Now inside Windows and the display properties, you also have to tell it to kind of use the internal GPU full time, so that it doesn't try to save the battery and go back and forth between the different GPUs. So I've already got that set up, and this is just going to be running right to this. I think this is a 1440p test. So without further ado, let's go ahead and run this Time Spy and see how it fares. Alright, so don't worry about trying to read these little numbers here. I'll have a graphic up at the end when we go over the results to show what all the different numbers are. But you can see this is obviously a little choppy. Now if you've never seen this Time Spy test before, it's pretty neat. I really like the game mechanic of it. I wish they'd make a game out of it with this little view thing that she's got that she can see back in time through the different displays. But we're going to let this run a little bit, and then I'll come back with the results. And this particular benchmark actually has 2 graphics tests and some CPU tests. We're just going to focus on the GPU tests. So it's going to run both of them. It's going to come up with a final score and an average FPS for both of the tests. Alright, so just using the MX150 built into this laptop, we got a score of 947. Like I said, I'm going to have a little chart to compare all these. It's interesting to note that the average is 1058, so it wasn't too far off the average. I'm not sure how someone got a 7000 score, because when you look at this little information bubble here, it says that's the best time with an NVIDIA MX150 and the Core i7-8550U. So I'm not sure how they got that score, but I'm going to tell you that 947, that's pretty low for any kind of 3D stuff. So like I said, I've used this laptop for like some 2D tower defense games and stuff, but never for 3D stuff. So next step is going to be hooking up the eGPU and then doing the same test again and seeing how well it does. Alright, so I've got this eGPU hooked up with the Thunderbolt cable and got it hooked up to power, and Windows did say, hey, we found a new Thunderbolt device and it's going ahead and using it. So I'm going to give it permission to use that Thunderbolt device, and it says, do you want to not connect it only once, or always connect? So I'm going to hit always connect. And I've already loaded the latest graphics drivers for both the NVIDIA card that's built into it and for the AMD card that's external. So we should see this thing pop up here in a second. So let's go ahead and look at Device Manager. And look under Display Adapters. And you can see it's seeing all three display adapters now. So the Radeon RX580, the NVIDIA GeForce MX150, and of course the built-in Intel UHD Graphics 620. So now that we got all three GPUs in there, let's go ahead and load up the benchmark software again and give it a test. Alright, so now you can see 3D Mark does recognize all three GPUs, so that's good. So it should give us a drop down to let us select that external GPU. Look at the pretty lights. So let's go ahead and go into Time Spy and see in our drop down that we've got the RX580. And we've got a warning here that says the rendering device is not connected directly to the selected display. The frame rate may be limited by PCI Express bandwidth and other factors. So this actually has a feature where if you don't plug in a HDMI monitor or DisplayPort monitor to the actual GPU, it's going to actually render the graphics and send them back into the computer through the same cable here. And assuming it's got enough bandwidth, it's going to actually render the upgraded graphics, the accelerated graphics on the built-in display. So it sees that there's only one display here, and that's why it's giving us that warning. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and run this test, and then I'm going to hook up a second monitor to it and run it again and see if the bandwidth does limit that at all. That'd be good to know. Because this is kind of handy how it is, just having this to accelerate the actual laptop itself without having to dock this thing up and have an actual display to it. But we'll test both ways and see how it goes. So let's go ahead and run this test and see how much better it is than the built-in NVIDIA graphics. Alright, so again, don't worry about the little tiny numbers there. I'll get a bigger version of that up on the screen. We'll see the test result also as a score. But I think you can see already that the frame rate's a little bit better. It's not by any means perfect, but it's a lot better than it was. This is actually rendering a 1440p test. So this is a little bit more heavy intensive than like a normal 1080p test. But I went ahead and chose this test so I could give it a good test and see what the difference is between the different devices. Alright, so here's our results from the same laptop but with the external GPU, and I think you can see that the score is a lot higher, 3265. Now we're just going to be looking at the graphics score here, so when I do the final comparison of everything, that's all we're going to compare is just the graphics score, since the CPU is going to be the same in this computer, but when we switch to a different computer, obviously we're going to have a different CPU. So we're not going to look at the total score, we'll look at the graphics score. So 3421, and then as we go down to the bottom here, we can see the detailed scores where it has actual frames per second for the two tests that it ran. So 22.56 and 19.42. So like I said, not perfect for this particular 1440p 3D gaming, but I'm sure at 1080p it would be plenty fine. And we can actually do an estimation here, pick a game. So if we picked like GTA 5 and picked 1080p Ultra, you can see that it's simulating or guessing that this particular setup would get over 150 frames per second. So that's going to be plenty fine. Now, what I want to do next is actually hook up a monitor to this to see if this score changes at all based on the throughput of this Thunderbolt connection. So let me get that set up and then we'll run that one too. Alright, so to get this set up, I hooked up an external monitor here, which I'll bring into frame in just a second. And I had to back out of 3D Mark so that it would recognize the second screen. I had to extend the desktop so that Windows actually thought there was two screens instead of just mirroring it. When it mirrored it, it just thought there was one monitor, and that wouldn't work for this particular test. So I extended the display, and now if we switch to the RX580, it's going to give us this warning again. But if we come down here and select this second monitor, then that warning goes away. So now, even though 3D Mark is running here, once I run the benchmark, it's going to pop over onto the screen here. So let's go ahead and run this test and see if our frames per second, if our score goes up any at all. Alright, so now you can see that 3D Mark has actually thrown this program right over onto the second display, and it's going to go ahead and run this test. Alright, so here's our results using the same setup but with an external monitor plugged in. So the monitor was actually plugged into the HDMI port of the external GPU, and we can see the graphics score went up almost 600 points. So 4008 instead of the about 3400 on the same test, but going back, rendering back into its own monitor. So not only that, but even down here with the frames per second, we gained about 3 to 4 frames per second on both the tests. So not a huge difference FPS wise, but the graphics score definitely tells me that there must be some limitation to this. Now, is it enough to make a difference that you can see? A couple frames per second, maybe yes, maybe no, but it's still fairly close. But it is interesting to note. So we've got one more test to do, and that's going to be putting all this stuff away here and getting a dedicated gaming laptop set up and running the same test. So let me go ahead and grab that for you. Alright, so what we got here is a Dell G5 15, which, like I said, is a couple year old, basically about the same generation as the Ultrabook was, and you can see here that it's got a i5 8300H. So even though it's an i5, it is the H type of processor, which is the higher power processor, versus the U that was in the Ultralight, which is a very, very low power, and of course it's going to scale down the CPU frequencies because of that. So it's got an i5, but it is an H, but it's got a GeForce GTX 1060, and it's the 6 gig model, not the 3 gig model. So when we compare this GPU versus a 580, they're pretty darn close. I usually go to UserBenchmark and put in the two to compare them, and this isn't, again, no benchmark is perfect, but I use this as just as a ballpark. And you can see here that the 1060 has a 2% bump over the 580. So in general, it's about the same. That's about as close as it gets. So we're going to run this test here. Before we do that, I just wanted to show you the size difference between the two laptops that we're doing here. So this is the Huawei, which is much smaller, much skinnier, and a lot lighter. So this is a pretty big tank because it's a gaming laptop. So let's run this this gaming test on the gaming laptop and see what happens here. We're going to do the same time spy, and let's run this thing. Boy, this is not looking good. There must be something wrong. Alright, so here's the results, but something is definitely wrong. You can see the score is very low, the graphics score is really low, the CPU score is actually just fine. But if we look at the average for this same setup is 3700 versus the 1100 that we're getting. So something's wrong. You can see that it sees that it is the right display and the right GPU. So it says it's using the right one. It's only getting 6 to 7 frames per second on the graphics tests. So something's not right. If we look at the GPU load, it was pegged out for both of the tests. So something's going on. Now, on all the other tests, we didn't look at this before, but on all the other tests, the GPU is definitely pegged out on the other laptop with both the internal and the external GPU, which tells me that all the tests that we ran were definitely GPU throttled, not CPU throttled. So this one is showing that it was definitely throttled. So I'm going to check out a couple settings. I did tell Windows to use the right graphics thing. I did tell the NVIDIA driver to use the right graphics thing. So let me check a couple things and see if there's something I can find and rerun this test. Alright, so I went ahead and downloaded UserBenchmark, which is a really great all-in-one benchmarking program that's free. Just download it from their website. And again, it's not perfect, but it does show you when something is not right. In this case, it's definitely not right. So here's the GTX 1060, and it is showing in the terrible range, which I've never seen a GPU in the terrible range before. So something is definitely not right. So let me look in all the different settings in Windows again and double check everything. Alright, I think I found the problem. And I'm kind of embarrassed to say what it was, but at the same time it's a good learning opportunity for everybody. And that is, there was no problems at all in Windows. It was simply the power adapter that I was using was not the right one. So Dell has used the same, I'll pull this out here, same barrel connector for most of their laptops for a lot of years, which is nice because you can interchange them unless you've got a gaming computer that needs a whole lot of power. And I had like a 130 watt power supply hooked up to it, and this one needs 190 or 180 watts. So once I plug the right one in, I think it's definitely going to have the juice it needs. So the computer is smart enough to scale down its performance based upon the fact that it doesn't have enough power coming into it. So that's a good thing and a bad thing. It's a good thing to protect itself, but it certainly had me chasing my own mistakes for quite some time. So without any further ado, let's go ahead and run this thing and see how it does this time. Alright, so it's already looking a lot better. We were running around 9 frames per second before, when it was not using the right power adapter. So now we're going to let this thing run and we'll compare it. Again, we're comparing it up against the RX580 external GPU that we had running on the Ultrabook. And on paper, this one should be pretty darn close, if not a tiny bit faster. So let's see what happens. Alright, so here we are with all the results here kind of tabulated in a nice little table thanks to Canva. And here is the MX150, which is the built-in GPU in that Huawei Matebook. And it is a discrete GPU, 2 gigs of RAM, but as you can see it's not a very good gaming GPU, but it's still better than the built-in Intel. Popping a score of 857. Once we plugged in that RX580 external GPU, then we got a very nice score of 3421. Which we can see is very, very close to 3435, which was the Dell laptop with the GTX 1060 6GB GPU. And then the best score of them all was back to the Matebook with the RX580 actually plugging a display right into the GPU, so it's not being throttled by that Thunderbolt connection. So this was a lot of fun. Like I said, I always wanted to play with one of those eGPUs. During the whole crypto mining craze, they were just price prohibitive. No way to buy one of those. So now that I've got one, I'm going to try it out in a couple different laptops. Maybe even hook it up to a MacBook that's got the Thunderbolt 3 connection on it and see if we can turn a MacBook into a gaming device. But hope you enjoyed this. If you did, go ahead and give me that thumbs up. I appreciate it a lot. If you like this type of stuff and want to see more type of tests like this, go ahead and hit that subscribe button. I'm always trying to figure out new things, so join me along on that journey. But thanks as always for watching, and until next time, peace out and geek out.